People visit these places every year, but there's something they don't know. In room 402, something happened that no one could properly explain. Some visitors said they heard strange sounds in the middle of the night. Others claimed they saw something moving in the dark. What really happened in that room is still a mystery. Don't miss out on the world's most haunted stories. Subscribe now and join me as we explore the unexplained. 1. Story: Chillingham Castle. I remember the first time I saw the castle in real life. It was late afternoon, and the sky over Northumberland looked grey and heavy, like rain could start at any moment. The road leading to Chillingham Castle was narrow and quiet. No crowds, no noise, just fields, cold wind, and an old stone castle standing in the distance. From far away, it already looked different from other historic places I had visited. The walls were dark and worn, like they had been watching people come and go for hundreds of years. As I walked closer to the entrance, I kept thinking about how this castle had been standing there since the 12th century, surviving wars between England and Scotland. Inside, the air felt colder than outside. The thick stone walls and narrow hallways made every footstep echo. A small group of visitors walked through the rooms with a guide who was explaining the castle's history. Everything seemed normal at first: old furniture, portraits on the walls, dim lighting. But then the guide mentioned something that caught my attention. He pointed toward a room upstairs and quietly said that visitors sometimes report strange experiences there. Locals call it the Blue Boy Room. According to the stories, people who stayed in that room during the night used to hear a child crying. Some said they saw flashes of blue light near the bed. Years ago, when parts of the castle were being renovated, workers reportedly found the bones of a young boy hidden inside the wall of that same room. At that moment, the story felt like just another old legend told to tourists, but things started to feel different when I walked down one of the long corridors alone. The hallway was almost empty, and the wooden floor creaked under every step. Old portraits stared from the walls. For a moment I stopped walking because I thought I heard something behind me, like a faint movement or a soft footstep. When I turned around, there was no one there. I tried to convince myself it was just the old building settling, but the silence in that corridor felt strange. The kind of silence where even small sounds suddenly feel louder than they should. Later, the tour moved to the lower part of the castle, where the old torture chamber is located. The guide explained that during medieval times, prisoners were sometimes held there, and the room still contains historical devices from that era. Standing in that dark stone chamber, it was easy to imagine how terrifying the place must have been centuries ago. By the time I walked back outside, the sun was already disappearing behind the clouds. The castle looked even darker than before. Maybe the ghost stories are just legends, maybe they're not. But after spending time inside those silent corridors, I understood why so many visitors leave Chillingham Castle feeling like the past there never really went away.
2. Story: The Ancient Ram Inn. The first time I stood outside the Ancient Ram Inn, I remember thinking how strange the building looked compared to everything around it. The houses nearby looked normal and modern, but the inn felt completely different, like it had been frozen in another century. The wooden beams were crooked, the roof looked uneven, and the whole place had this dark, quiet feeling around it. I had read before that the building dates back to the 1100s and was once used by workers connected to a nearby church. But what really made the place famous were the stories people had shared for years. Visitors, investigators, even the owner had claimed that strange things happened inside the house. When I walked through the front door, the air inside felt thick and dusty. The rooms were small, with very low ceilings and old wooden floors that creaked under every step. It didn't feel like a normal historic building. It felt heavy. At first, everything was quiet. I walked slowly through one of the narrow hallways and noticed how the walls leaned slightly to one side. Old paintings and objects covered the rooms, but the lighting was dim enough that shadows moved whenever someone passed by. Then I stepped into a room that investigators often talk about, the bishop's room. The moment I entered, the temperature felt colder. I can't explain exactly why, but it was one of those moments where your body reacts before your mind does. I remember standing still for a few seconds, listening carefully to the silence around me. That's when I heard it. A small sound behind me, like something lightly scraping against the wooden floor. I turned around quickly, expecting someone to be standing there, maybe another visitor walking through the room. But the doorway was empty. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to make sense of it. Old buildings make noise all the time, I told myself. Wood expands, floors shift, wind moves through the structure. It could have been anything. Still, the strange feeling didn't go away. Later, I spoke with someone who had spent more time studying the history of the inn. He told me that paranormal teams have investigated the building many times over the years. Some reported hearing footsteps when no one else was inside. Others claimed objects moved slightly or doors closed on their own. The owner of the inn, John Humphreys, even shared stories about being pushed by an unseen force while sleeping in one of the rooms. By the time I stepped back outside, the sun was already setting and the small village around the inn had gone quiet. The building looked darker than before, its crooked roof casting long shadows across the ground. I'm not the kind of person who jumps to paranormal conclusions. Old buildings have strange atmospheres, and history can make places feel unsettling. But standing there that evening, looking back at the ancient Ram Inn, I understood why so many people say the same thing after visiting it. Some places don't just feel old. They feel like something from the past is still there, watching.
3-story Pendle Hill. The day I visited Pendle Hill started like a normal hike. The countryside in Lancashire looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. Green fields stretched across the land, small stone houses sat quietly in the distance, and the hill itself rose slowly above everything like a silent watcher. I had heard about Pendle Hill long before coming here. Most people know this place because of the events that happened in 1612. That year, several people from nearby villages were accused of witchcraft. After a series of trials known today as the Pendle Witch Trials, 10 of them were executed. The story has been part of local history for more than 400 years. Standing at the base of the hill, I kept thinking about that history. It's strange how a place that looks so calm can carry such a dark past. The path going up the hill was quiet. Only the sound of wind moving through the grass and the distant calls of birds broke the silence. As I climbed higher, the view became wider, and the villages below started looking smaller and smaller. About halfway up, the weather changed suddenly. The wind grew stronger, and a thick mist began rolling across the hill. At first, it looked normal. Hills in England often get foggy, but the speed at which the mist appeared felt unusual. Within minutes, the clear path in front of me became harder to see. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and looked around. The hill was almost empty. I could barely see another hiker far below through the fog. That's when I heard something that made me pause. A faint sound carried through the wind. It almost sounded like someone speaking, but the words weren't clear enough to understand. I stood still, listening carefully, trying to figure out where the voice was coming from.
The strange thing was that the hill around me looked empty. For a moment, I thought maybe the wind was echoing someone's voice from further down the trail. Sound can travel in odd ways across open land. Still, the timing of it felt strange, like the voice was closer than it should have been. I continued walking slowly, keeping my eyes on the path. The fog moved across the ground in waves, sometimes clearing just enough to see the landscape again. When I finally reached the top of Pendle Hill, the wind was stronger than before. The view should have been incredible from that height, but most of the land below was hidden under the gray mist. Standing there, I couldn't stop thinking about the events that happened here centuries ago. The fear, the accusations, the trials that ended so many lives. Maybe the sounds I heard were nothing more than wind moving across the hill. But as I walked back down the trail, one thought kept returning to my mind. Places with a history like Pendle Hill don't just hold memories. Sometimes it feels like the past is still whispering through the wind.
4-story Pluckley Village. The first thing I noticed when I arrived in Pluckley Village was how quiet it was. Not the normal kind of quiet you find in a small countryside village, but a deeper silence that made every little sound stand out. The road was narrow, lined with old houses and tall trees, and the whole place looked like something from another time. Pluckley has a reputation in England that most villages don't have. Locals often say it's one of the most haunted villages in the country. Over the years, many different ghost sightings have been reported here. Some stories talk about a screaming man near the woods. Others mention a woman seen near the old churchyard. At first, I thought most of these were just old village legends. Small towns often collect stories like that over the years. But walking through the village in person felt very different from simply reading about it. I decided to take a slow walk along a path locals sometimes mention in the stories. The path ran beside a group of tall trees, and the branches above moved quietly in the wind. It was late afternoon, and the sky was slowly turning darker as clouds moved across it. The strange feeling started when I reached a small open area near the edge of the trees. There was no one around. No cars passing, no voices from nearby houses, nothing except the sound of wind and the occasional rustling of leaves. I stopped for a moment just to take in the atmosphere. That's when I heard something behind me. It sounded like a quick step on dry leaves. I turned around immediately, expecting to see another person walking along the path, but the path behind me was completely empty. The trees moved slightly in the wind, but there was no sign of anyone there. For a few seconds, I just stood still, listening carefully. Sometimes animals move through the trees, I told myself. A bird or a small animal could easily make that sound. Still, the timing of it felt strange, almost like someone had been walking a few steps behind me. I continued down the path, trying not to think too much about it. But the quiet around the village made every sound feel louder than it should have been. Even the wind through the branches seemed to carry strange echoes. Later, I spoke briefly with a local resident near the village pub. When I mentioned the stories about Pluckley being haunted, he smiled in a way that felt half serious and half amused. He told me that people have been reporting strange sightings in the village for decades. Some visitors claimed they've seen shadowy figures near the woods. Others say they hear footsteps when the paths are empty. Of course, no one can prove these stories are truly paranormal. But as I walked back through the village road that evening, with the sky growing darker and the trees casting long shadows across the ground, one thing became clear. Whether the stories are legends or not, there is something about Pluckley Village that makes the past feel very close, almost close enough to follow you down the path.
5. Storied Borley Rectory. The first time I visited the small village of Borley in Essex, it didn't look like the kind of place that would be known around the world. It was quiet, peaceful, and surrounded by farmland. The road was almost empty, and the houses looked ordinary. If you didn't know the history of this place,
You would probably drive through it without thinking twice. But Borley became famous for one reason: a building that no longer even exists today. Borley Rectory once stood near the village church. It was built in the 1800s and served as a home for the local rector and his family. Over time, strange stories about the house began to spread. People claimed they saw unexplained lights in the windows, heard footsteps when no one was there, and sometimes even reported seeing a figure walking near the grounds. Even though the rectory burned down in 1939, the stories surrounding the place never disappeared. When I walked toward the area where the building once stood, the land looked surprisingly normal. Just grass, trees, and the nearby church tower rising above everything. But knowing what had happened here in the past made the place feel different. One of the most famous stories connected to Borley Rectory is about a ghostly nun. According to local reports from the early 1900s, villagers sometimes claimed to see a figure dressed like a nun walking silently near the rectory grounds at dusk. No one ever proved the sightings were real, but the story became part of the village history. I remember standing near the path beside the old churchyard as the evening light slowly faded. The wind moved gently through the trees, and the quiet countryside around the village made every sound noticeable. At one point, I heard a faint noise coming from behind the stone wall near the path. It sounded like something lightly brushing against the gravel. I turned my head, expecting to see someone walking along the other side of the wall, maybe a local resident taking an evening walk. But when I looked over, the path was empty. For a moment, I simply stood there, looking across the open field where the rectory once stood. The land was calm, but the feeling of the place was hard to explain. Maybe it was just the history. When you know that so many strange stories were reported in the same location, your mind starts noticing every small detail. Before leaving the village, I spoke briefly with a man who had lived in the area for many years. When I asked him about Borley Rectory, he didn't laugh the way I expected. Instead, he simply said that people have been sharing strange stories about that place for generations. Some visitors come looking for ghosts. Others come because they are curious about the history. Then he said something that stayed with me during the drive home. He told me that whether the sightings are real or not, Borley is one of those places where the stories never really leave, even after the building is gone.